Hi, this is Simple Politics with Kim Wehle. I want to welcome my special guest today, Rod Rosenstein, who is former Deputy Attorney General under the Trump administration, but also a longstanding DOJ sort of stalwart for many, many years. We'll talk about his career, but it's a real privilege to have you today, Rod. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, Kim. I'm glad to be with you.
So a lot of law students actually watch this show, and so I'm wondering if you could just talk a little bit about your background growing up in Philadelphia and why you ended up in law school, and then also why public service, because you went to fancy law school, right? Harvard and Penn undergrad, but didn't go right into a big law firm.
That covers a lot of ground, Kim, but yes, I grew up in the Philadelphia suburbs. I went to the Wharton School as an undergraduate and then directly to law school, which was more common in those days in the mid 80s. It's more common these days to take time off between college and law school. But really, I think one of the significant events that dictated my future was that I served as an intern in the U.S. Attorney's Office in Massachusetts. And coincidentally, Bob Mueller was the U.S. Attorney at the time. I had very little interaction with him. But I met a lot of the prosecutors in the office, and that really attracted me to the Department of Justice. I think there are a number of reasons for it. And number one, of course, is the mission to serve the public good. Number two is the opportunity for a young lawyer to get the kind of responsibilities that you really can't get in big law firms, where you're immediately thrown in and handling significant cases and getting to spend time on your feet in court. So those opportunities really appealed to me. But I didn't intend to spend a career in the Department of Justice. So if you had asked me when I joined in 1990, I certainly wouldn't have expected to have been there almost 30 years later. What kept me there really was the collegiality of the staff, the esprit de corps that you share with so many attorneys throughout the department. I know you experienced that yourself as an assistant U.S. attorney, and so it never got boring. And obviously, the pay is significantly lower than what people make in the private sector, but my family and I found it was manageable, and so I was fortunate to be able to spend almost 30 years in government.
And can you explain? I think after your tenure with Donald Trump, some people on one side of the aisle or the other feel that that was a politicized or political experience, or they're very critical of you for certain decisions you made. I wonder if you can explain what it is about the Justice Department that traditionally makes it different than, say, a politician in Congress, or even now that you're in private practice, a private lawyer. You mentioned the mission and the esprit de corps. Could you describe that and how it's different for people that haven't been inside government?
It was a real challenge for me, Kim, to try to explain that to people in politics because they have a difficulty relating to it. But in the department, there's a certain culture, a culture of independence. And what we mean by that is that federal prosecutors make their decisions without regard to partisan considerations. Now, obviously, politics plays into the priorities of the department, it plays into the policies of the department at the upper levels. But when it comes to the front lines, when those decisions are made about whether to pursue particular cases, those decisions are made without regard to partisan considerations. Now, as I said, it's very difficult to convey that to a skeptical politician or to the public that's been told through cable TV shows that all these decisions are politicized. But within the department, a real effort is made to rule out politics and make sure we're making those decisions on a principled basis.
Well, how is that possible when the Justice Department answers to the President of the United States, right? So three branches of government: judicial branch, Article 3, legislative branch, Article 1, executive branch, Article 2. Traditional executive power is prosecutorial power, police power. That's kind of the sort of classic example. Justice Scalia used it famously. And the Attorney General works for the President of the United States, who's a politician. So, is there a law or something that is in place that adheres to that, what you just explained? That is, that prosecutors don't make political decisions, but because it seems like they would, given that their boss is the President of the United States.
Well, it's a combination of positive law and of norms, and let me explain that. As I said, politics certainly plays into the policies and priorities of the department. The whole point of elections is to influence the operations of the executive branch. So the Justice Department is not independent of the executive branch in the same sense, for example, as the courts, which go on and make the same decisions without regard to elections. But elections have consequences, and so those consequences can be reflected in changes in priorities. For example, some administrations emphasize narcotics enforcement, violent crime enforcement, others emphasize civil rights and environmental enforcement. Those are high level political policy decisions. And then there are changes in things like charging policies, whether or not the department should bring the most serious, readily provable offense, whether mandatory minimum sentences should be pursued. Those are policy decisions that are made based in part upon politics, and everybody in the department is obligated to follow them. But when it comes to making determinations about whether to prosecute people in individual cases, politics is not considered. And to explain how that works, for example, it would be wrong for a federal prosecutor to factor into a decision whether or not the person's political affiliation was allied with the president's or not. That is, it would be wrong to prosecute people because they were political opponents of the president, or to not prosecute people because they're political allies of the president. The department needs to be neutral in applying those principles. Now, within the Department of Justice, there are laws that restrict it. If it were the case, for example, that prosecutors were making decisions based upon political affiliation, we're asking about whether people were Republicans or Democrats, whether they supported the president or didn't, that could actually make out a selective prosecution defense. And so a case could, in theory, be thrown out of court if a prosecutor were to make that decision. So that's the legal sense in which the department is independent. And then in terms of norms, traditionally, presidents allow the attorney general to make those decisions without telling the attorney general who should or shouldn't be prosecuted.
Well, I mean, I know this was after your tenure, but would you say then, or what do you say to people who criticize Attorney General Barr's decision to intervene in the Roger Stone proceeding and the Manafort proceeding in a way that I think people thought was partisan? And even the judge in at least one of those cases was upset and felt like, listen, this is not a neutral intervention by the Department of Justice. It's highly unusual. I think that sort of distorted, whether right or wrong, the public's view of the Department of Justice. Is that the kind of thing typically that the prosecution would do once someone's pleaded guilty, for example, and you're at sentencing?
Well, typically there is oversight, but typically that happens behind the scenes. So what was unusual in particular about the Stone case was the department made its initial sentencing recommendation and then was overruled by the attorney general. That's very unusual. But the attorney general maintains that he made that decision without regard to partisanship. That is, without regard to the fact that the president publicly announced that he wanted the attorney general to do it. And in fact, Attorney General Barr said that the president was making it impossible for him to do his job by creating the appearance that these decisions were based on politics. So I think it's important, Kim, to distinguish between the appearance and the reality of independence. Bill Barr, I believe, could probably pass a polygraph test that he made that decision independently of the president. But obviously, the appearance that's created by the president's public comments undermines that.
So, put yourself in the new Attorney General Merrick Garland's shoes. What do you think needs to be done, if anything, to rehabilitate the image of the Department of Justice in the eyes of regular people? And I say this because, I mean, for our viewers, the worst case scenario is a Justice Department that has this massive authority to bring cases that wind up putting people in jail, depriving people of their liberty or even their lives if there's an execution, which of course under Donald Trump, federal executions started again. So how do you think Merrick Garland needs to approach the situation so that people no longer think of the possibility of prosecutors picking and choosing who to prosecute and who not based on party politics? That's, in my mind, the worst case scenario, that it has nothing or little to do with the facts and the law, or that's secondary to you're my buddy, you're not my buddy, so I'm going to use this massive power for and against you. I think some people perceive the Justice Department that way now.
I think the challenge, Kim, is there are people on both ends who perceive that.
Yes.
There obviously are people who believe the department was biased in favor of President Trump and people who believe it was biased against President Trump. And that's going to be the biggest challenge for Merrick Garland, is that will continue. The critics, the skeptics will continue to snipe at decisions that are made and allege that they're made based on politics. it's going to be Attorney General Garland's responsibility to make sure that doesn't happen. So that if there were an independent review, if, for example, the Inspector General were to go in and look at why these decisions were made, they would find they were made based on independent, nonpartisan considerations. But I think the biggest challenge that Merrick Garland is going to face is that you can't please all the people all the time. Even if he does absolutely 100% the right thing, odds are that in many cases, a large portion of the population is going to be skeptical of what he's done. So that's a huge challenge. That's a challenge that I faced during my tenure as deputy AG, to try to promote public confidence when I believed we were doing the right thing, but there was skepticism based upon what people were hearing in the media. And I think that that's a tremendous challenge.
Do you agree with Attorney General Barr that Donald Trump made it really hard, more harder perhaps than in prior administrations? I know you've worked for many presidents. You're a registered Republican, but you've worked for Democrats. 8 years of Barack Obama, the longest sitting U.S. attorney under Barack Obama. So I think your track record represents sort of this neutral nonpartisanship. But whether you're on the right or the left, pro-Trump or anti-Trump, whatever words, do you agree that that the last 4 years have really been hard for the Justice Department in terms of its perception of legitimacy by virtue of Donald Trump?
I agree with the point that Bill Barr was making, which is if the president publicly announces his preference for a case being prosecuted or not prosecuted, that creates the appearance that partisan considerations are going to be reflected in the decision making. So whether they are or aren't, and as I said during my tenure, I'm quite confident they were not reflected in the decision making, but the president talking about it in that way creates that public perception, and that undermines public confidence in the rule of law.
And so what do we do about that as Americans? I mean, I talk a lot about the Constitution, and I think people think it's self-executing, that it just grows arms and legs and wings and comes down and saves us. But of course, if it's not enforced, it becomes a nullity. It's, like a contract that guy walks off the job, takes your deposit. Unless you go and enforce it, you're not getting your money back. What do people do, Americans do, when you have a president who is undermining the ability of the Department of Justice to do its job in a way that doesn't distract it, having to deal with politics? And I say that because you were impeached, right? You were impeached by, I think, Republicans in the United States Congress, in addition to being attacked on Twitter by the president, put behind bars in some kind of meme. And of course, people on the left think that you're, hopelessly compromised. What do you do? I know you're not a constitutional scholar, but Harvard Law School. What do we do as Americans to shore up those norms again and to ensure that the government functions with legitimacy? Because without legitimacy, a lot falls by the wayside with a perception.
Those are a few of the things that happened during my tenure. I wasn't actually impeached. I want to be clear about that. I was threatened with impeachment.
Threatened, thank you.
There was a
I don't want that to get out.
small group of extremist congressmen who filed articles of impeachment that didn't go anywhere. But yeah, I mean, we're operating in a hyper-partisan environment, and I think what we need to do in the Department of Justice, what they need to do, I've been gone almost 2 years, is to make sure that they create that culture within the department so decisions are made without regard to politics. And just to give you one example, something that happened in my tenure, the president publicly criticized the department for charging 2 Republican congressmen with crimes. Now that may have created the appearance of political meddling in the Department of Justice, but the reality was very much the contrary. The reality is that the prosecutors who handled those cases, one case in New York, one in Central California, went about their business, were unaffected by anything that was said by the president or the politicians or the pundits, and did their job in the right way. And so I believe, Kim, as lawyers, as officers of the Department of Justice, you're not going to be able to prevent politicians, whether it be the president, members of Congress, or pundits, from sounding off and criticizing what you're doing. What you need to do is make sure that you can defend your own actions so that if there's an independent review, and there's a lot of oversight of the Department of Justice, right? There's congressional oversight, but there's also internal review by our Inspector General and our Office of Professional Responsibility. And the goal is that if they come in and do an independent review, they will find that there was no partisanship in the decision making. That's not going to insulate the department against criticism from its own chain of command or from outside. But I think for any members of the public who want reassurance that the department is operating in the right way, it is reassuring to know that there's oversight by judges and by internal investigators.
So can you explain a little bit what is an inspector general? Because we heard a lot about that with Trump firing them. I mean, in theory, I think a lot of them were established post-Watergate to sort of shore up accountability mechanisms. They're supposed to be independent. But again, seems like people saw the president almost it was perceived as retaliatory, where there was this oversight. Could you explain what is an inspector general to people that haven't taken administrative law?
Yes. Yeah, the inspectors general sprang up really for the most part in the 1980s, particularly in the late 1980s. And we now have inspectors general in all significant federal agencies. And they are not entirely independent in the same way as I explained, the department's not independent of the executive branch. They report to the attorney general, but they also have independent reporting responsibilities to the Congress. And their responsibilities really fall into three categories. Number one, oversight of department programs. Number two, investigation of contractors that do business with the government. And so they actually have criminal authority to pursue criminal investigations. And number three, oversight and investigative authority over department employees for wrongdoing. So a lot of their work is actually auditing, non-criminal auditing. But they also have authority over violations committed by department employees and contractors that deal with the department.
So you were deputy attorney general, and I think it surprises people a couple things. That the Department of Justice isn't just the prosecutors, that it includes sub-agencies like the FBI, and that there are other federal law enforcement arms. You think of wherever people are watching the Derek Chauvin trial, local police. Can you explain what was your job and who who makes up the Department of Justice in a practical sense, day-to-day sense?
And the Department of Justice has in total, I think, about 115,000 employees. And a third of those employees are FBI. So the FBI is the largest component of the Department of Justice, and about a third are Bureau of Prisons employees. And the number of prosecutors is actually relatively small compared to the overall size of the department. And as you point out, there are investigative agencies outside DOJ. So the DOJ law enforcement agencies, the police in the Department of Justice, primarily the FBI, the Drug Enforcement Administration, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, and the U.S. Marshals Service. Those are badge-carrying federal agents who report up through the Deputy Attorney General to the Attorney General. But there are also law enforcement agencies in other components. Just about every federal department has its own enforcement arm. For example, everybody's familiar with the Secret Service, which was in the Treasury Department, now in Homeland Security. And so the Postal Inspection Service, Internal Revenue Service has its own criminal investigation division. So all these police agencies investigate cases, but in order to prosecute a case, you need the approval of a prosecutor in the Department of Justice. So in that way, the Attorney General and the department exercise some level of supervisory authority over all federal law enforcement. And then, as you mentioned, there's state and local law enforcement agencies, which do not report to the Department of Justice, which bring their cases through local prosecutors or through state attorneys general. So there are a lot of different law enforcement agencies throughout the country.
So the attorney general is at the top, and the attorney general is part of the president's cabinet, answers directly to the president, can be fired at will by the president. I think that surprises people as well as U.S. attorneys. How often does the attorney general weigh in on individual investigations? Like what broke this week, Representative Matt Gaetz and the leak that he's being investigated, not a target, and maybe you can explain what that means, for potential racketeer or trafficking of a young girl. And it's also broken that investigation didn't happen just under Biden, that it started under Donald Trump. How much does that happen at the lower levels of the Department of Justice? When does it go up to you in your former role, up to the Attorney General, and even up to the President of the United States?
Well, the general guidelines of the department call for reporting of significant cases, including cases that are politically sensitive. So a matter like that, if it were opened by the department, probably would make its way up to the Attorney General. Very rarely is there any reporting to the president about individual cases. Now, if there were a high-profile matter, it's possible the president may have an interest in it. But typically those matters are handled at lower levels of the department. The Gaetz matter you made reference to, there's been no official acknowledgement by the department, so I don't know whether he is a subject or a target. I don't know if it's a leak or not. One thing people don't often appreciate is that in order to conduct an investigation, you need to go out and interview witnesses. You need to subpoena documents. And so there are people who learn about investigations who have no obligation of confidentiality and are not government agents themselves. So we don't really know whether that case was leaked in the sense that somebody in government inappropriately spoke about it, or whether it's some third party who knew about the investigation and maybe speculating about what's going on.
Um, I like that you mentioned facts and investigations and evidence. I mean, my experience of the last few years is even in the classroom with law students is that it's hard to establish for young people the difference between a fact, a law, policy, and ideology, um, and conspiracy theories, fake news, fake facts. And I know I listened to your interview, your first interview post DOJ with Fox, where you talk about the rise of the digital age. And you and I met years and years ago back in Ken Starr's office, where we had Xeroxes, we had newspapers. There was no phone that had the latest news. How do you respond, do you think, to this problem of fake facts and
Mm.
fake news and this perception now, rising perception that there is no truth? I mean, as a prosecutor, that's kind of antithetical, but I do think it's helpful to reestablish that. How will you respond to that argument that it's all your point of view?
My hope, Kim, is that through educating the next generation, which you're doing in your classroom, will have that impact long term. When I look at the distinction between my parents, for example, who are in their mid 80s, and my children, who are around 20 years old, they have very different views about what the news is. My parents grew up in an age where you would watch the news at 5:30 p.m. or 11 o'clock p.m. On one of three stations, and that would be it. That would be the truth, the facts. So they're accustomed to getting their facts through intermediaries, through trusted intermediaries. My children, though, are not. They actually, I think, are far more skeptical about news sources. So I think that has pros and cons. They're less likely to be misled on the one hand. On the other hand, they're less likely to settle to believe that they actually know what the truth is. And what I tell them, what I'm sure you tell your students, is to make sure you read widely and be skeptical. And in terms of the distinction between facts and evidence, if there's a fact, find out who's it attributed to. Who, if you're reading a story written by a reporter or watching on TV, who's making that representation and what's their basis of knowledge? That's the process that we go through as investigators in the Department of Justice. We don't just take somebody's word for it. We ask them, well, how do you know that? What resources are you relying upon? How credible is the information that you're conveying? And we just need to teach people to be skeptical about taking in information and not to believe it just because somebody they know or a celebrity that they respect is saying it on TV or on the internet.
Do you think that this has driven the increasing problem of domestic terrorism? And what even is that? How would you define that? I mean, I've read, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, that the Department of Justice has identified that, and the FBI has identified that as one of the major criminal threats facing America. We saw it arguably culminate in the January 6th insurrection. Um, do you think that social media and the digital age has contributed to that? And back to my Merrick Garland question,
Mhm.
what is his challenge right now with domestic terrorism?
Well, yes, I believe that domestic terrorism is fueled by the internet. All sorts of crime is fueled by the internet. It's an ability for people who might be inclined to do something wrong to find like-minded people that they otherwise would have difficulty finding. They can find them in these corners of the internet. And so that does fuel domestic terrorism the same way that it fuels child exploitation and abuse. And that is a challenge, one of many challenges that Attorney General Garland will face. In terms of domestic terrorism, though, I think he has a big advantage in that the Department of Justice and the FBI have been looking into this. They know who these groups are, they know who the leaders are, and so they're actually in good position to investigate. The upside of the internet, of course, is that people leave trails. And as we saw with the insurrection, people actually bragging about their role, touting it on social media that they'd been there. That leaves a trail that makes it very easy for prosecutors and investigators to follow. So the internet both fuels crime, but also facilitates detection of crime.
Now, on January 6th, I'll just be honest, I sat watching from my living room, and having lived in or around Washington for a long time, like you have, watching these people climb the Capitol, smash the windows, swarm like ants at a picnic and for hours and asking myself, where is the law enforcement presence? Can you weigh in on that as someone who was in charge of the federal side, at least to some degree? What happened? I mean, if you agree, that was kind of stunning.
It was a horrible scene, Kim. It's the kind of thing you expect to see in the third world, not in America. But the answer is the police were obviously unprepared. And if you think about your typical police force, they're prepared for isolated criminal activity. And they may be prepared for small groups, but they're not prepared for riots. And so riots like that tend to overwhelm police in any area. I think the issue here is, was there enough time for authorities to respond if they had done the right thing and responded appropriately? And so there are a number of after action reviews being done. People have already lost their jobs over this. And I think that we'll find at the end of the day that the answer is that they should have been better prepared. There should have been more officers there before the riots. There should have been a military response earlier when the riots began. And if there had been a significant increase in law enforcement and military presence, in fact, the protesters might not have gotten into the Capitol at all. So hopefully we'll be better prepared next time. We'll learn lessons from this experience, but there certainly are lessons to be learned.
And well, why weren't they prepared? I mean, I know this is a bit speculation, but you know, we were. I told my kids don't go downtown that day because it was publicly reported that there was going to be a huge presence. The president had been tweeting about it. Go to the Capitol, um, and even for peaceful sort of on the mall events, you see barricades, you see police officers on horseback. You might see bomb sniffing dogs. I mean, living in Washington, you see more than we saw. You might see, cement barricades. There might be larger fencing. I know for inaugurations or the 4th of July that the crowd is maneuvered in certain ways. There are checkpoints. There are backpacks that are checked. It seems like a pretty big delta between, gosh, we kind of underestimated this and what we saw. What do
Uh,
you think happened in the preparation? And I also read, the FBI had a report, I think the day before or there something. I mean, you know the terminology better, but this was something that the FBI had their finger on. What do you think could have gone wrong, and who's responsible for that meltdown?
Kim, I don't know the answer to that. I assume that the authorities didn't know exactly what they were going to face. But if you look at the history of the way we've fortified Washington over the years, there was a time when you could walk right up to the front door of the White House. There was no fence. Now there's a fence. The fence gets higher. The street in front of the White House gets cut off. As time goes on, we adopt more and more protections. And I think that unfortunately, only after this incident occurred, I think now we'll be in position to anticipate those sort of issues in the future. So I don't know. I think certainly mistakes were made. Fortunately, I wasn't in the chain of command, so I can't get the blame for that one. But I think certainly there is plenty of blame to be spread around.
Well, and in the moment, if you could weigh in or explain, why didn't the police in the moment do more to arrest people or to detain people or to sort of, and I know they were outnumbered, but I think it surprised people, and to this day that everyone just kind of left. And now there's obviously a national sweep, a lot of arrests, there's prosecutions going on. But is that typical that this horrific event would happen, people dying, massive vandalism, really defecating in the Capitol, really outrageous things. And we're watching what happened to George Floyd in Minneapolis, which of course is local police, a different situation. But he doesn't appear on all these videos to be in any way threatening, not even close to what was happening in the Capitol. Is there what do you, again, speculation? I know you weren't there. What's typically going through a law enforcement official's mind in something like that? Like, listen, I need to do something about this. And why didn't it happen in the moment?
I think, Kim, you explained it, which is they were just outnumbered and overwhelmed. And their mission was to try to protect the occupants of the Capitol, the senators and the congressmen, in which they succeeded. And I think they deserve credit for that, having successfully evacuated all of our representatives and senators and staff. And that was their priority, was to try to keep people back. And if you're going to make an arrest in a circumstance like that, it's going to require 3 or 4 officers to make the arrest. escort the person through the crowd, and then you lose those officers from the line. And so I think that explains it. But as I said, I haven't studied it myself, and I'm sure there will be plenty of reviews that will establish what should be done differently in the future.
Okay, so what you just said, I think, shed some light on it. Typically, to arrest, you're talking about three people to do a safe arrest, and then those people have to process. Those officers have to process an individual, which then leaves fewer within the Capitol, and you had the entire United States Congress, or the vast substantial majority of them, and their staffers who needed some level of protection. So it's a matter of, listen, I only have one of me. Where do I put my focus in this moment?
Correct, and I do think they deserve credit for successfully protecting the occupants of the Capitol.
Well, I completely agree. I mean, they're heroes upon heroes, and that I can't help but pivot then to the commander in chief, right? These were people that the officers put their lives on the line. Um, with a crowd shouting, "Hang Mike Pence, find Nancy Pelosi." Donald Trump, as president, tweets a pejorative comment about the vice president of the United States, which arguably exacerbated the threat potentially on the vice president's life. What do you think? And I know this is not a legal question, um, really, in terms of if there's a case to be brought in court, which I think is a different question. What do you think should be the level of accountability or the mechanism of accountability for the commander in chief for what happened on January 6th?
Well, for anybody involved in fomenting the riot, there's potential civil liability. And of course, there are potential criminal charges. I think the U.S. Attorney's Office has said that they haven't ruled anything out. And so we'll just have to wait and see where that investigation goes.
Well, we saw, I mean, yesterday too, the Capitol officers filed a civil lawsuit, but I did a piece this morning in the Bulwark. What's missing from the complaint is acknowledgement of Nixon versus Fitzgerald, absolute immunity for civil actions, which makes sense. The presidents can't worry about being sued every time they make a decision as commander in chief. Of course, within the Justice Department, indictment of sitting presidents is as a policy matter kind of out of the picture. I have a piece that came out in the Stanford Journal of Law and Policy this month, breaking that one down. But there's only so much that the courts can do to hold a president accountable. I mean, where's in this moment in 2021, Rod? What's left of Congress's role in terms of accountability for presidents? Because what's good for Donald Trump is good for Joe Biden, is good for Joe Schmendrick or whoever comes after, or Jane Schmendrick. I mean, this is about the office. This is about the belt and suspenders and the power of the office. It's not red, it's not blue. So as someone who's been inside government for so many years, what would be your expectation for inciting a riot, which, as you indicated, is a crime, for the commander in chief in terms of
Well,
accountability?
you're presuming that he's responsible for inciting the riot as opposed to obviously inspiring, inciting it, willfully inciting it. Well, could be prosecuted. In
Yeah,
terms
words matter. Thanks for that correction. I agree with you.
of the
He has a
congressional,
role, though. Would you not agree? I mean, and he's not in a position like everybody on the street. I mean, he's the president, so arguably he has a higher standard that he should adhere to, not a lower standard.
as I said, I don't want to speculate on who might or might not be prosecuted. The U.S. Attorney's Office has announced they're going to do a full investigation. Your question about what Congress's authority, though, is Congress does have oversight authority. Well, Americans, number one, have the right to vote, right, to decide who's going to be their president. Number two, Congress has the power to legislate. They can exact sanctions on a president through legislation, through budgetary authority and other means. And of course, they can impeach, which they did twice, and they can convict, which they did not do. So I would not say that Congress is powerless over this sort of thing.
Oh yeah, I mean, clearly the Constitution sets up mechanisms. The question is, given the polarized nature of our political system, which you mentioned, even in discussing with politicians, how difficult it was to explain that you're not a politician when you're in the Department of Justice making decisions. The question is, and I get asked this a lot by students, where do we go from here? Um, uh, and in terms of accountability, I wonder if you could explain to a layperson what is the difference between finding facts and applying law in a court
Mhm.
and what we see from legislators and the president, frankly. This concept of facts and law and boundaries and accountability. I mean, I think we're seeing a bit with, again, with the Chauvin trial. It's really different inside a courtroom. There's only so much you can get away with.
Right. The difference in a courtroom, Kim, is that what you believe happened is irrelevant. All that matters is what you can prove beyond any reasonable doubt with credible witnesses who have firsthand information. And that's typically not what you see on TV. What you see on TV are people who are biased and opinionated, who are repeating hearsay or expressing their personal opinions. None of that's admissible in a courtroom. So that's the first issue: is that the nature of the evidence has to be firsthand evidence from credible witnesses. And the more significant check in the courtroom is, particularly in a criminal case, is that we need to prove our case beyond any reasonable doubt. That's what the jury is instructed. It's not enough if you just think 51%, 60%, 70% likelihood that something happened. You need to be persuaded beyond any reasonable doubt. And it needs to be a unanimous jury. So in a federal court, you need 12 randomly selected people to unanimously believe beyond any reasonable doubt the defendant is guilty of a crime. And so that factual standard is extraordinarily high. And as you point out, is very different from what you may read in a newspaper or see in a cable television show.
Well, and there's also rules of evidence, right, and rules of procedure that also bind the judge.
Correct.
So one of the things I think we've seen is just a degradation of truth out of elected officials. Things that would have been ended a career 10 years ago are just normal now, because there's no check on that. But in court, there are. And I think people thought the post November 4th litigation relating to the alleged stolen election, which has no evidence, was somehow political maneuvering in part on the part of judges. What would you say to those who thought, oh, judges are biased, judges are anti-Trump, judges, overstep their bound? And the president himself, I think, was quite critical of the courts.
Kim, I'm not sure if it's historically true that things that would have ended careers years ago don't end them today, because the truth is we knew so much less years ago. We didn't know about the alleged affairs of JFK or of FDR. We didn't know about these things in the old days. And there were, of course, scandals in the distant past. If you've seen the musical Hamilton, you know that these sort of scandals occurred even in the early days of the Republic. So I'm not sure that is new. What is new is everybody knowing about everything in real time and being unable to sift truth from rumor. That, I think, is the biggest challenge of our era.
Oh, interesting. I like how optimistic and sanguine you are about the future of American democracy. This is making me happy. Well, so your tenure, I wonder if you wouldn't. I mean, you worked for multiple presidents. You mentioned. Um, could you take us inside the Oval Office with with Donald Trump a little bit, a little snapshot of what that was like to work there?
I didn't spend a lot of time in the Oval Office or even in the White House. And most of the time, if I was in the White House, it would have been in the Situation Room. But the experience of being Deputy Attorney General obviously is very different from U.S. Attorney. As you mentioned, I served for the entire Obama administration as U.S. Attorney and for 4 years in the Bush administration. It's a very different experience, I think, in any era. It was particularly different, obviously, now because of the president's failure to adhere to traditional norms of how we expected presidents to act and what we expected presidents to say. It made the job a little more challenging in that respect. But from my perspective, and I believe that if you talked to my staff, you would hear it from them as well. We ran the department in the normal traditional way. We ensured that we were making all the decisions with the appropriate degree of independence, and that partisan concerns and that spin that was going on in the news media was not influencing the decisions that were made in the department. So from that perspective, I think that you would have found that the day-to-day operations of the department were no different than they've been in the past.
Were you sort of a bit concerned or skeptical about taking the job?
No, I wasn't. You know, having spent at that point 28 years in the Department of Justice, I think, Kim, I would have taken the Deputy Attorney General job no matter what president offered it to me, and I would have tried to do it in the same way.
And when once you got there, there was this drama around a memo relating to Hillary Clinton, and then fairly shortly after, we saw the referral to your former, I don't know if it was your boss, but Robert Mueller, you mentioned in law school you worked for him. Um, what was that, and how was that different from the independent counsel
Yeah.
that where we met many years ago? Why did you do that, and what is it for people when you hear special prosecutor, special counsel, independent? I think these terms get completely jumbled, and they do it a lot on air as well. What is that, and why did you bring him into this?
Yeah, there's a lot packed into those questions, Kim. And let me address first the distinction between a special counsel and an independent counsel. An independent counsel like Ken Starr in Whitewater was appointed by the court under statutory authority that expired in 1999. But once appointed, an independent counsel was truly independent of the Justice Department. He did not have to report to the Attorney General. The Attorney General wasn't in a position to overrule him. So it was truly an independent branch of government in that respect. Uh, the special counsel isn't like an ordinary federal prosecutor. He reports to the attorney general or the acting attorney general in my case, and the acting attorney general has the authority to overrule or to remove him for cause. And so, in that sense, where the independent counsel was subject, I think, to legitimate criticism because of the degree of autonomy from the department, which sort of freed him from following the ordinary rules that federal prosecutors follow. Although technically they were obligated to follow the rules, but they're operating in a very different environment. The special counsel operates within the mandate of the Department of Justice. So there is a significant difference structurally for a special counsel. The reason I appointed him was because I believe that it was important to promote public confidence in the independence and the outcome of that investigation of Russian election interference, which is largely forgotten in the wake of so many other things that have happened over the past 4 years. But when I took office, there was credible evidence that there had been efforts to interfere in the 2016 presidential election, and that those efforts were spearheaded by Russians and by, in at least one respect, the Russian government. And I thought it was important to ensure that we conducted that investigation expeditiously and independently, and we could maximize public confidence in the outcome. Now, obviously, there's nothing you can do to promote 100% public confidence in the outcome of anything. But I believe that it was effective in resolving that Russians did interfere in the election. We actually have the names of Russian alleged perpetrators who've been charged in federal court. Some of them are Russian government officials. Some of them are what are referred to as internet trolls, these folks who create phony accounts on the internet and try to foment unrest in the United States. And I think it served its purpose in that respect.
So what do you say to the charges of, oh, the Justice Department was on yet another witch hunt?
Well, from my perspective, it was not a witch hunt. It was never a witch hunt, and Bob Mueller doesn't do witch hunts. He was looking
Which is
in.
a political vendetta type thing, using that power to get someone, which we talked about earlier.
I mean, obviously that was the criticism that came from the right during the investigation, but I don't believe that's fair in the way the investigation was conducted. Now, there is still an ongoing investigation by John Durham into the origins of the Russia matter, which occurred before I arrived. I became deputy AG in uh, uh, late March of 2017. The investigation had begun about a year earlier. So I think we should wait and see. Hopefully, we'll have the results of that investigation soon, and so we'll know whether there was a legitimate basis to initiate the investigation. But I think we should all wait for the results of that matter.
And that was under Obama. You weren't in that Department of DAG position, Deputy Attorney General position, when the process actually started.
I knew nothing about it other than what I read in the newspaper. Correct.
Um, I listened to your interview on Fox, and you mentioned that one of the things you regret the most, or I don't mean to put words in your mouth, but that don't feel great about, is what happened with immigration and the family separation policy, in which children were separated from their parents. I wonder if you could weigh in the complexity of that and
It's a very challenging issue.
how.
Yeah, I mean, we're doing it again. We're accepting children, but not parents, and so parents are making this difficult choice to separate from their children and sending these young children alone across the border, which is a horrible situation. The truth is that there's no easy answer for immigration. Now, I don't think the Trump administration got it right. I'm optimistic still the Biden administration will find the answer, but we certainly haven't seen it yet. I just think it's a terribly challenging situation. One of my former colleagues wrote an op-ed this week, Chris Landau, who was our U.S. ambassador to Mexico, and he pointed out that one of the things that we're overlooking is that what's fueling this immigration, at least by the adults, what's fueling the illegal immigration, is the fact that Americans are hiring illegal immigrants to perform jobs. And as long as we continue to do that, we're going to have this pull factor that encourages people to immigrate illegally to the United States. So the whole system is a mess. And I say that having had a small role in it for my 2 years as deputy AG. We had a backlog of, I think, somewhere in the order of 500 to 600,000 civil immigration cases when I arrived. We made every effort to reduce that backlog, but instead it's now over 1 million cases and growing exponentially. So, my hope is the Congress will step in and come to some resolution that may include some form of amnesty for folks who are already here, but that will actually make the very difficult choice to enforce immigration laws and to restrict immigration to people who follow the rules.
Well, which part of it, just for the record, which part of that do you wish you had done differently in your role, and what part do people get wrong about you in terms
I don't
of
want to comment on
policy?
what people get wrong about me. I think that the Trump immigration policy was not effective. But as I said, if you look at what's happening today, tens of thousands of children are being separated from their parents today, and that's not the right solution either. So I don't know, Kim, what the right answer is.
Does it need more funding? I mean, do we need more people along the border, more judges, more facilities? Is this a resource problem
Mhm.
as much as a policy problem, or is it more of a policy problem? That is, when I say policy, we need more laws from Congress, which you mentioned, I agree. That's something that hasn't been able to get through the Congress for many years. Or is this about money?
It's a policy problem and a money problem, but the policy is driving the overwhelming surge of immigration. And the biggest challenge we face is that we're unable to make the difficult choice to send people home after they get here. And as long as we don't do that, they're going to keep coming, no matter what the law is. And that's the fundamental challenge: is are we actually prepared to make those difficult choices to send people back, or do we take the humanitarian position that once they get here, we're going to allow them to stay, even though they didn't follow the rules? And that's
Do
a
you think the Biden administration's doing the right thing and not sending the kids back, the ones that come alone, which is mind blowing to me?
I think the problem, Kim, is it's motivated by humanitarian concern, but the problem is it's fueling the problem because when people learn that their children are allowed to enter and stay, they're going to send more children. So although I think it's motivated by the right thoughts, it has this horrible collateral consequence of separating families.
How did the kids? How were the kids sent back under the Trump administration, if that did happen? So imagine a child comes in, a 10-year-old, and the parents, which is, you're a parent, I'm a parent, it's inconceivable to send my kid into another country without having the language, anybody there to greet them, any sense of, I mean, so the desperation of these parents, I can't fathom. But if a child were sent back,
Mhm.
what does that look like? Is they just plopped on the other side of the wall and said bye, or is there a system?
That's not my understanding. No, I'm not an expert on this. The Department of Justice doesn't have responsibility for tracking the children or for holding the children. My understanding, though, is that when they were returned, they were escorted back to their home countries to their families. But as I said, I wasn't personally involved in that aspect of it. But that's my understanding of what happened.
So
Not that
there,
they were turned away, but they were taken care of until they were returned to their families.
um, police reform quickly. What do you think Congress needs to do? And, you know, where do you stand on this idea? I mean, I think this, again, frankly, is just bad rhetoric sometimes, defunding the police, reorganizing the police, Blue
Mhm.
Lives Matter, all of that stuff. People get into some kind of team and then they don't look at the nuances. But obviously, I don't know, maybe it's not obvious to you. It seems obvious to me that there's a racial injustice problem in this country that goes back to, the founding of it on the backs of enslaved human beings. I mean, that's unfortunately our history. That's something we have to grapple with. How do you get your mind around that problem going forward? as someone in the Justice Department or a policymaker, if you're advising a member of Congress, et cetera.
Mhm. Yeah, I agree with you, Kim. I think defunding is an unfortunate term because I think what we really need is funding other components of social welfare system that can supplement the police. You know, I think that the challenge the police have in urban jurisdictions is we're expecting too much of them. You know, the problems are just too immense to be solved by law enforcement. So if we could restrict the police to dealing with criminal justice issues, particularly with violent crime, and if we could have other social welfare agencies deal with psychological mental health issues, I think that that would go a long way towards solving the problem. So I'm not in favor of defunding. In fact, I think one of the challenges that we face is that many urban police departments are not adequately funded, and particularly the police officers are not paid enough to attract the kind of people that we want to be police officers. So I think we ought to put more effort, more thought into whether we're putting the money in the right places. And I do think that there are departments. I was U.S. Attorney in Maryland and had to deal with the Baltimore Police Department. There are departments like Baltimore that need reform, and I think that Congress can help. We have federal models for how police officers ought to operate, and I think we can provide funding and encourage departments to reform themselves. It's not going to happen overnight, but we really do need to change the culture of some of these urban departments.
Well, I think in New York, there's a mandate from the state that certain departments reconfigure. And I know a friend who's the mayor of Ithaca, New York, my alma mater, Cornell, who is proposed establishing two arms of the police department. That is one that deals with violent crime and one that deals, the cat in the tree, a friendlier, less intimidating side of things. And I'm paraphrasing, but my reading of the reporting on this is he's getting pushback from the police as well as from other constituents that, need to defund completely. But then there's the other end of the spectrum saying, don't mess with my police force. What do you do with police officers or police departments that don't want to reform? And I agree with you. I mean, I have a tragic situation with a friend of mine whose son took his life with a gun recently, called the police first and said, I'm in an unsafe, I don't feel comfortable. I'm a threat to myself. The police came, didn't do anything left, and then this tragedy happened. That's the moment where you need a mental health professional, not a police officer, and the outcome was absolutely horrific. But what do you say to the police departments that push back on this idea that they're not one-stop shopping and reform is actually something we all need to get behind?
Okay, what I think we ought to do is try out different approaches in different places. We shouldn't try to impose a one-size-fits-all model, but when departments are receptive to this, I think there ought to be efforts to try to fund maybe, as you suggest, a shadow force that responds to situations that don't call for law enforcement. Because you can't train police officers to be social workers. I've worked with a lot of police officers over the years. 99% of them are decent, honorable people, but they're not trained to deal with those mental health circumstances. And not only that, but they face the pressure to resolve a call and to get on to the next call because they're busy, all throughout their shift. So I think that there's something to be said for having a separate component that deals with issues that can be resolved short of law enforcement, recognizing that more law enforcement is not the solution to every problem.
Now, you mentioned again on your last interview that you're a Lincoln Republican. And I write for the Bulwark, Bill Kristol, also kind of align with sort of core Republican ideals. And I think it's helpful to identify for people what that is and how maybe it's different. And the reason I segue to that is because to get police reform, to get immigration reform, to get some sort of reshoring up of norms around the presidency, we need a functioning Congress.
Mhm.
And so the question on the table is, particularly with the filibuster, is the Republican Party up to the task, and how is it different from the party of Lincoln, which, for non-historians, listen, they were anti-slavery, the anti-slavery party way back when. So I wonder if you could weigh in on that. No, you're not as a lawyer, not as a former DOJ official, but just as a person who, in my experience, cares a lot about, knowing you, cares a lot about a value system.
Right. Well, I think that really sums it up, Kim. I think some people like to pigeonhole Republicans and assume that If you're a Democrat, then a Republican is everything you hate. But that's not the way that I view it. I think the Republican Party has a lot to contribute, and I always took offense when people would try to stereotype the Republican Party. For example, there was a cadre of Republicans who called themselves conservatives, who were some of my harshest critics throughout my tenure as Deputy Attorney General. And when people would say, the Republicans are out to get you, my response would be, well, but I'm a Republican. I don't know what those guys are. And I think we recognize, every party is a coalition. Some people with extremist views, some people with moderate views. My views are not necessarily defined by the stereotype of what you believe the Republican Party is. I also believe, Kim, in good government. That's what kept me in the Obama administration for 8 years. I was a registered Republican. I continue to do my job, and I was proud to have the opportunity to do it because I think that governing is something separate and apart from partisan politics. And that, I think, is a fundamental Republican principle. That is that we need good government and we should support good government.
How did you find good government? I mean, was it there? Was it in place under Donald Trump? So didn't incite, but had a role for sure in January 6th, right? Is a presumptive nominee at this point for the Republican ticket. At least that's according to Bill Kristol and other long-term Republicans for the next presidential administration. Again, for our law students watching, what is good government for Rod Rosenstein?
Good government is government that pursues good public policy, that promotes public safety, promotes an economy that gives people opportunities to succeed. And I think that all those things that we associate with good government are consistent with my concept of the Republican Party.
Well, listen, just to be clear, I'm not interested in sort of picking on Donald Trump per se, but I, as a constitutional scholar and a mother, am concerned about the structure of government and the trajectory it's going. And he is front and center and still in the middle of that, whatever name you want to put on it. From my perspective, could be a Democrat. I don't care. And so is that something you worry about? Take his name out of it? Do you worry about democracy in this moment, Rod?
I would say always, Kim. I mean, I agree with you that the Constitution is not self-executing. That's a line I used to use in a lot of my speeches. And so it requires us to train people about their responsibility in a democracy. And as you say, whether it's Republican or Democrat, the people you vote for matter. It makes a difference, from the local up to the national level. How many times do people walk into a polling place without really any clue about the people they're voting for, what they stand for? And so I think that the sort of thing that you do in trying to raise awareness about these things, to point out to people that the Constitution matters in your daily life, and that the decisions that you make influence the future of the country, I think that is really significant. And the point that I used to make to people, Kim, is that we don't really take our values from presidents and politicians. The values come from the grassroots. The values come from our parents and our teachers, from our role models locally. And that's why I have confidence in democracy.
Well, and I couldn't agree with you more. My next book talks a bit about that. And I want to just, as a sort of last question, I'm so glad we're back to values, because that has nothing to do with blue versus red. What are the ones that you learned from your parents, you learned through the Justice Department, you might tell your kids, and you would tell, and maybe they're different, but you tell law students watching this? Because I mean, Rod, I do get students who ask me, I don't know if I'm a Republican or a Democrat.
Right.
And my answer is, that's the wrong question. The question is, what do you care about?
I agree.
How do you articulate that to people that look up to you, Rod?
I don't know how many people fall into that category, Kim, and I'm not a politician, but the values that we teach our kids: to work hard, to play by the rules, to treat everybody with respect, whether they agree with you or not. To hear people out and try to see things from their point of view, and not to assume that you always know the right answer. Those are the kind of values that I teach my kids.
Well, and what's next for Rod Rosenstein? Book deal? I heard no. Private practice? Really different world, right?
Private practice, Cami. I'm working for a big law firm. It's a very different world. It's a first experience for me in the private sector after 30 years, and I'm enjoying this, and I have no other plans, and no book deal in the works.
Advice for budding lawyers. Final question.
My advice for young lawyers is to try to get some experience in the courtroom. So many lawyers these days never make it to court, and I think they miss out on an opportunity to see how the system really works. So that's my best advice for young lawyers. Find a way, whether it's pro bono work, whether it's working as a prosecutor or a public defender to get some experience in court.
And how do you get in the federal government? I get that all the time. You want to work for the federal government. Professor Whaley, how do I get in the door?
Well, don't be too picky. There are a lot of jobs in the federal government. The Department of Justice, obviously, for lawyers tends to be number one on the list, but every federal agency has lawyers. And so there are plenty of opportunities. So that would be my advice. Don't be too picky.
Well, I want to thank you, Rod Rosenstein, for coming on today, Simple Politics with Kim Wehle. It's been a real honor to speak with you, and I've learned a lot. So thank you again.
You're welcome. Good to be with you.